Shalom, giving all praise unto Yahweh Shemel Shai Bashimo Kakadash. Double honors unto the apostles of Great Millstone and honors to brothers that be pushing this truth in sincerity throughout the four corners of the earth. So this is going to be a relatively quick video going into the economic situation that we are experiencing here within the UK, and we're going to experience here within the UK and within the United States. And as a result of the economic decline of the so-called Western world, we're going to see the mass digitalization of currencies and the resurgence of the idea of the universal basic income. And as these people become more reliant on the government, they're going to not realize that there's a play being played upon the people, which is to move towards the RFID mark of the beast, which is spoken about within the book of Revelations, the 13th chapter and the 16th verse, which I'll get in a little while and in the little section. So prior to the C-19, which was an orchestrated attack by way of the governments, the elite banking families, the rather more, in order to transfer the assets, or rather more the human resources that was somewhat privately owned or thought that it was free, into privately owned or owned by the elite banking families. You got a situation where the elite banking families have been pulling the strings in the background, but they want to come in the forefront and have you people overtly know that you are slaves unto them. So you got a situation where the economy's got to be crashed, and they want you deeper and deeper and deeper more into relying onto the government. And in being reliant on the government, you have to realize that these governments, when they get their money and when they get their figures and numbers for the beginning of a financial year, they borrow that money into the existence from the elite banking families. So they're going to do away with the middleman, which is going to be these different governments that you have out here, which are all in cahoots with the elite banking families, and ultimately have it to where the people are chipped, where you got mass testing and you got mass vaccination. Now you're going to have it to where you got mass chipping, which is going to be coming pretty soon. It's looking like Esau's going to set this thing up soon. So let's set the stage prior to the C-19 situation that we've experienced since March last year. It's nearly 12 months since the C-19 situation has been announced within the world, going back onto the so-called spread, the first spread that we saw within the Wuhan. We had a situation where from 2008, the economy wasn't doing very great, and a lot of these businesses weren't doing brilliantly. Now, when we look at the economic history of America, and we look at the economic history of these different countries that mapped their currencies off the back of America, we see that there was a declaration of the Federal Reserve. And prior to the Federal Reserve, you had it to where the dollar was backed by gold. Now, it was backed by a handful of other things, if I remember, but there was a time when the US dollar was backed by gold, then subsequently oil, wherewith you had the petrodollar. And that's why you had it to where you had a multitude of wars being fought within the world as a result of these different countries such as Iran and Libya and so on and so forth. Multitude of different countries either going to a gold-backed standard or selling their oil in other currencies other than the dollar. And whenever we've seen that particular situation play out within the earth, we've seen it to where war was always on the playing cuts. And that's the situation that we're seeing with Iran, as they try to move away from the dollar and try to save their economy or whatever, or make it to where they're gonna be have a more beneficial life, or rather have a more beneficial situation elsewhere. They're gonna try to move away from the dollar. That's gonna be the best way to put it. So that was the setting the scene prior to the C-19. You had a situation where these currencies was backed pretty much by nothing. And ultimately, because they brought into existence, there was always going to come a period where the GDP, and I believe the figure that we're looking for is 90%, where the GDP versus the national debt. Remember, these currencies are brought into existence by way of the private banks that you have within these different countries, such as the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and so on and so forth. They borrow money into existence, and then subsequently you have what's known as fractional reserve banking, where that money is given into these different government organizations such as nursing and so on and so forth. And then the nurses spend the money, and the money goes into a bank. The bank borrows out 90% of that money. And that's where you have currency. You got it to where the flow of money goes through the economy, and hence the term currency, which fractional reserve banking reduces the value of a currency. Borrowing money into existence means to where, has it to where whatever currency you're dealing with, it's always going to have it to where it's going to crash. So you had it to where you had all types of different economic crashes simply because this money is borrowed into existence. And once you reach about 90% GDP to debt ratio, national debt ratio, the country becomes bankrupt. And I believe America is at around 150%. And you can check out that information for yourself. Don't quote me on it, but you should be able to check out that information. I forget what video I'd watched that information from. So that's setting the stage of the economic stage since 2008, where with most of these countries were on the brink of collapse, economically speaking. Britain, America, and so on and so forth. You had it to where the Chinese, pretty much their economy was on the up. And you had it to where these different countries, such as Iran, was trying to move away from the dollar. Now you bring in the C-19, and you had a situation where pretty much everybody lost money except for the companies that the elite banking families want to keep going forward, such as your Amazon, wherewith when you look at the New World Order, Amazon fits nicely into the so-called New World Order, where you're going to be allowed to go out when you're allowed to go out. And you're supposed to stay indoors when you're supposed to stay indoors. So Amazon fits nicely into the so-called New World Order plan, where with the elite banking families want complete control of movement. And when you go to where you got complete control of movement, a situation where you go online, everything that you get is tracked, processed, rationed potentially. That's going to fit nicely within the New World Order plan. And you better believe a lot of these companies that are New World Order companies, or companies that they want to take into the so-called New World Order, into the so-called New World, you better believe these companies were set up by the elite banking families and these individuals such as Jeff Bezos and so on and so forth, Mark Zuckerberg, so on and so forth. These individuals are what you know as frontmen. They're nothing but middle management, and there's what's known as the board of directors, and those board of directors are the elite banking families. But going back onto this situation, reading from here, we see that there was a lot of companies hurting and failing companies which took the stimulus package. This is out there within the United States, and they was failing prior to the C-19. Let's read a little excerpt of this. It says, Steinmart Inc. was desperate for shoppers long before the C-19 forced closures of its discount department stores. So what does this go to show you? That throughout the course of this year, not only was things bad prior to this year or this 12-month period, you had it to where they was already bad, but ultimately they was going to get worse. And we know they're going to get worse because you had it to where these businesses have been closed. During the past several years, the Florida retailer had hemorrhaged tens of millions of dollars. And this is a representative of how shopping habits have changed, number one. And two, how you got it to where a lot of these different businesses are failing for multitude of reasons, whether it be online competition or whether it be simply the simple and the most obvious reason why a lot of these businesses are failing is that because the middle class, just like Rome when it was falling, the middle class is being eroded away. We see parallels between how America is falling and faltering and hemorrhaging, like the term that's used over here, and we see how that America, just like Rome, is hemorrhaging. So it says during the past several years, the Florida retailer had hemorrhaged tens of millions of dollars, much like what we see here within Britain. A lot of these businesses are losing money. Like many struggling businesses, the company in June turned to the federal government paycheck protection program, of which what we got here within England, we got a very similar government program, and that government program is known as so you got it to where you got what's known as the stimulus check within the United States. So if you're locked down, they'll give you the C-19 check. And here within the United Kingdom, we got what's known as the furlough pay. So these are all ideas that seem good in principle, where with these failing businesses have money distributed onto them, and it goes into their bank account, and they could potentially pay off their debts or whatever. Now, when we go into economic understanding and we understand how a country functions, we see that when the government starts issuing out money onto people to help them out of the situation that they're in, that's not help. That's really hurting the economy. It would be better for those companies to just go bust. What we have is a situation of quantitative easing, where with money is being printed out and is being distributed onto these different people, whether we're talking about the UK, where you got it to where you got the furlough scheme, and the furlough scheme funded Britain pretty much for about 3 months last year, 3 to 4 months last year. You had it to where production had stopped, and you had it to where money was being printed by the United Kingdom the government here, and people were getting paid basically to do nothing for about 3 to 4 months. Now you got it to where some people are working, and if you work in a cafe, the government's paying your check. So that's a lot of money that the government is printing out and giving onto these different people. Now, when we look at the GDP of these different countries that are doing these government programs, GDP is going down every day because they're not producing anything. They're not producing anything. How can you produce anything if you're supposed to stay at home? You can sell services all you like, but ultimately the middle class consists of manufacturers and people that produce goods and sell it onto other different countries. And when you go to where people ain't manufacturing and making things to sell off to other different countries, that means the middle class is non-existent. So when you go to where people are at home and they're locked down within their houses and they're not making and producing particular goods, that means to say, although they're getting a stimulus check from the government, whether it be the United States or the United Kingdom, even though they're receiving that check, what's actually happening is that the government is printing out money. And that all plays into the grand scheme of the elite banking families, where with the value of these different currencies, rather more, is being devalued. Because the currency game, the whole thing with the money system, is a very important thing in terms of how this thing is going to move forward. Because as we see from the scriptures, we see that there was going to be a need for this chip to be implemented. So how is Esau going to play? Well, he's probably going to crash this economy, or he's going to have a worldwide event where with the chipping is going to have to be implemented. But it's most likely going to be an economic crash. Revelations 13 and 16, it says, he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, to receive a mark within their right hand or in their forehead, that no man might buy or sell save he have the mark. So you can get tracked, processed, rationed, whatever the situation is going to be. When Esau tries to set this whole thing up, you're going to have that chip. But one of the reasons why this is one of the reasons why you're seeing these stimulus checks being processed. In any logical economy or in any logical place, they would weigh out the economic implications of locking down and not locking down. And of course, the elite banking families have said it to where you're going to be locked down because they're setting up for this economy to get crashed. And like I just showed you there with that first article, I showed you that the economy wasn't doing brilliantly not too long ago anyway. Yeah, that no man may buy or sell save he have the mark of the beast or the number of his name. He who hath wisdom, let him understand and count the number of the beast. And it tells you it's 666. So these economies are going to fail pretty soon. They're going to go bust. Just like how you had it to where you had the stock market crash and you had the 2008 crash. This crash is going to be a massive crash. And we were speaking about the economy crashing prior to the C19. So now the economy, you had the individuals like Max Kaiser and many other economic analysts that was watching the economy prior to the C19. And they were saying this whole thing is going to crash, man. It's going to crash. They was predicting it was going to crash in 2019, whatever. There's all types of different articles that were saying 2019 is going to be the year where the stock market was going to crash. Okay, it didn't, but that indicates that the economy was going to crash prior to they predicted it crashing prior to the C19. So what's going to happen pretty soon as a result of the C19? You're going to have a situation where you're going to have a cataclysmic economic devastationary situation play out across the whole entirety of the globe, and hence the need for a digitalized version of the system that we had prior to that, so you don't have the similar situation play out. Hence the reason why they're going to have it to where everybody's going to be chipped. Hence the reason why you're going to have it to where I lose my train of thought, but I was going to make another point. But pretty much this economy is going to be crashed, man. They're going to crash this economy. They're going to crash this economy. So that's the video. Hopefully it was of edification. With that, I'm going to say, all praise unto Yahweh Hashem, Yahshua, Hashem, Kwakadash, double honors unto the apostles, the great millstone, and honor you brothers that be pushing this truth in sincerity. Shalom.